Hey, everybody. Welcome, 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 welcome. So glad to be here with all of you. It's going to be an awesome stream. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Great things are happening, and we got plenty to talk about tonight. So glad to be here with all of you. It's going to be great. So let's jump right into it.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Hey, everybody. Welcome, 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 welcome. So we're doing our show here tonight, a late night stream. The way this works is I give my opening remarks. While I'm giving my opening remarks, I'm writing down your super chat questions. If there's something you want me to talk about in the second half of the show, I'll be following the chat. Send me a super chat. I'll put it on the screen. And then I will answer it in the second half of the show. The middle of the show, we do a roll call where we find out who it is on the other side of the camera. And then after that, I answer your questions for the remainder of the program. So if there's something you want me to talk about in the second half of the show, shoot me a super chat. That's the way we roll. Everybody, all is well. We are continuing to march ahead with the Center for Political Innovation. I am still tired from that conference. I'll tell you that much. That conference, it was a success. It was a smashing success. To have the guests that we had, to have the speakers that we had, Tara Reid, Garland Nixon, the Uhuru movement, the musicians that were there, Jesse Jett, and my good friend Paul, and People's Party, Nick Brana was there, and Chris Halulli from the Party of Communists was there, and Stansfield Smith of the Free Alex Saab Committee was there. It was such a great success. And I almost don't want to draw attention to what I'm drawing attention to right now. I almost don't want to go there. I almost just don't want to go there. But I feel like what I'm about to show you is important. It's important because I continue to be proven correct, right? I told you that BreadTube was an operation to basically, it was a psyop aimed at deprogramming the alt-right and manipulating the socialist movement to serve imperialism. That's why I wrote a whole book, BreadTube Serves Imperialism. I talked about ContraPoints. I talked about H-Bomber Guy. I talked about Destiny. I talked about all kinds of people. After, the premise of that book, the reason that I wrote that book was because I was approached and told that Dr. Steve Hassan, who is this cult expert who's got ties to the intelligence community, is linked to, the Cult Awareness Network and forcible deprogrammings and kidnappings, that he was involved with it. So that's why I wrote that book. After I wrote that book, The Gray Zone came out and proved that Abigail Thorne, another prominent BreadTube, who I didn't talk about in the book, but Abigail Thorne, another prominent BreadTuber, that she was on the payroll of the British government, and that NGOs in Britain that are tied to destabilizing Syria, they're tied to the British royal family, are funding her work and paying her to try and discredit anyone who's critical of the lockdowns, right? And, they're basically doing exactly what I said, right? That it's a deprogramming operation. They're paying her to deprogram anyone who might be critical of lockdowns, right? Not a shocker. I was right about that. And then, after I told everybody BreadTube serves imperialism, they're agents of imperialism, and they all went defensive and said, how can you say that? That's crazy. You think everyone who doesn't agree with you must be CIA, blah, 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 blah. And then, of course, we had Gray Zone come out with their report documenting it. And so then we had more of that. So then now, fast forward, when the Ukraine war started, all of these BreadTubers, all of them, Destiny, ContraPoints, Vosh, Thought Slime, all of them became huge supporters of the Azov Battalion, the actual Nazi division of the Ukrainian military. They all became huge supporters of it, right? They just, and they made Ukrainian flags. They were fundraising for Ukraine. And I made a video and I said, do not donate to Ukraine, because this is going to turn out to be one of the, I think at our conference, Tara Reid pointed out that this war in Ukraine is going to be proven someday to be the biggest money laundering operation in history. They've shown evidence. CBS News was forced to take down a news story they did. They removed it from their website, but they showed that only like 30% of the weapons the American government is pouring into Ukraine actually end up in the hands of the Ukrainian military. Right. And that, so much money is pouring into Ukraine, and Ukraine's got a Patreon, and that this is going to be proven to be pretty soon. It's going to be proven to be a huge money laundering scam, because they're pouring all kinds of money into Ukraine, into a country that is notoriously corrupt, that was called corrupt by the New York Times. But all the breadtube people are, give all your money to Ukraine, right? Sell your house, sell your car, and give it to Ukraine. They all need money. You give your money to Ukraine. All those poor Ukrainians, give them money, send your money to Ukraine. And they're all pouring all their money into Ukraine. Now, I told you they serve imperialism. I was right. And now the latest was that Vosh wanted to start World War III over China, over Taiwan, right? And he was promoting Nancy Pelosi's provocation. He was, promoting Taiwan separatism. So just to prove to you once again that I am right about these bread tubers, just to make my point, I am about to show you something that if you have any doubt in your mind about who BreadTube works for, who Vosh works for, this is solid proof. This is solid proof. This is 100%. I mean, if this is not proof of who BreadTube works for and who they serve and what they're about, I mean, you're never going to be convinced. This is just classic, right? This is just classic. So you all will know that the Uhuru movement, the African People's Socialist Party, which has been around for 40 years, is led by Omali Yeshitala. They publish Burning Spear newspaper. They have the Uhuru Solidarity Movement for white people who support them, the African People's Socialist Party. We were honored at our conference to have them come. To our conference. We were honored to have them there. The FBI raided their offices, pointed guns in their faces, calling them Russian agents, all because of their anti-imperialist stance, because of that. So we made a point of supporting them and chanting no more raids at a time that they are facing terror at the hands of the FBI. So Vosh decided to chime in and tell his viewers about it. And this is what Vosh did. I'm only going to show you a little bit of this because I find him obnoxious. And most of what he says, he's insulting our faces. He's saying that at one point, he's like saying that all of us in the group have faces that are shaped like tanks. And he's just childishly insulting our appearances and doing what he does best, which is just being an idiot on the internet. But this, what I'm about to show you, this is proof of who Vosh works for. I'm going to show this to you. Watch it at your own risk. Viewer discretion is advised.
Who's that? Who's that guy?
No more raids! No more raids! We are proud to have guests from that organization here today to show that we are not afraid.
The mic is over there. Okay.
We offer nothing but unequivocal full support and solidarity for them while they're under attack. Please stand up.
These are the Uhuru guys, I think. These are the insane cultists who got notoriety by calling Anne Frank a Karen.
False.
On Twitter.
False.
It's the caliber of political activism we're dealing with.
False. Woo!
Are these the guys whose leader was arrested for having dead bodies in his compound?
False.
Yep, that was like 2 weeks ago. Also just
False.
one dead body.
False.
To my knowledge.
He's just lying there. He is conflating one group of black revolutionaries with another group of black revolutionaries. I guess all black people look the same to Vosh, right? He sees all black people. He can't tell the difference. Black Hammer. It's an organization led by a guy named Ghazi. that, they do a lot of provocative social media stuff, and they've said stuff about Anne Frank that's deeply offensive, stuff like that. Completely different organization. The Uhuru movement is a black socialist group that's been around for 40 years. It's led by Omali Yeshitali, African People's Socialist Party. The groups have nothing to do with each other. Ghazi was in the African People's Socialist Party at one time, but that was years ago, and he was kicked out of the group, and they had a falling out, and I don't even know what it was about. There was no one dead at Omali Yeshitali's house. There was no one in the African People's Socialist Party has ever said anything about Anne Frank. He's lying. He's intentionally lying to get you to support FBI raids against a group of black revolutionaries. Nobody in the African People's Socialist Party has been charged with any crime at this point. No one has been charged with anything. Ghazi and Black Hammer and the dead guy in the house, that's a totally different group. It's a totally different organization. Totally different goals, totally different outlook. One of them is a social media group that wants to raise money to buy land and likes to offend people on social media. One is a Marxist black revolutionary group with deep roots in the community. Totally different organization. He's just lying to you because he wants you to support the FBI pointing guns in the faces of black revolutionaries, dragging black revolutionaries out of their homes. I mean, this is, and it's, you want to talk about racism. All black people look the same, Devosh, right? I guess, if the FBI murdered Fred Hampton, he would say, oh, isn't he like that rapper I heard about who was involved in drugs or something like that? It's like, that's the level of what he's doing. One group of black people sounds like another group of black people. So that makes FBI terrorism and raids somehow okay. That is what Vosh is saying here. Now, what do you call somebody who runs interference like that, who engages in that level of lying and dishonesty in order to help the FBI? It looks to me pretty blatantly like Vosh got a phone call. Yeah, we just raided the homes of a group of black revolutionaries. But they support Russia, so they're no good. What can we do to make it okay? How can we make sure that none of the people that have been protesting racism for years think it's okay? I know. We'll say they're the same as this other group. We'll say they're the same as this other group of black people that has nothing to do with them, and that they're anti-Semitic, and that someone died or something like that. There's this other group of black people that have made a lot of social media drama. So we'll say that this group that has nothing to do with this other group is the same as that, and most white people are racist, and they think all black people are the same, and that'll work. Okay, very good. All right, Bosch, your instructions are to say that the Uhuru movement that has not done anything, that none of them have even been charged with any crimes, your job is to pretend that they're the same as this other group, Black Hammer. Got it? Okay, very good. Click. It's that blatant. It's that blatant, right? When Mumia Abu Jamal was on death row, and they were going to execute Mumia, I can see Vosh on his stream saying, well, Mumia is the same as some African dictator who committed genocide. They're both black, right? They're both black. They're both the same. So, this is, and you can, we all hate Vosh, right? We all love to hate Vosh, but hundreds of thousands of people watch this. This is disinformation. This is a government disinformation operation to try and get you to think that terrorizing a group of black activists because they support Russia, because their leader went to Russia one time to have a meeting with some Russians, that is okay. Who is Vosh working for? I was right. And you can deny it all you want, but what kind of revolutionary sees a group of black activists get raided by the government and says, how can I make this okay? How can I convince people that this was somehow a good thing? This is a level of dishonesty. This is, you want to talk about cop behavior, you want to talk about, asset and informant behavior. This is really, really blatant. He's trying to convince you that the government repressing a group of black socialists is okay. And in order to convince you to do it, he is intentionally lying and saying that they are the same as a completely different group of black socialists and hoping that you think all black people look the same. And they're black, right? They're black. They talk the socialist thing. They must be the same, right? I mean, it's racism, number one. It's dishonesty, and it's intentionally running interference for you know who. And that is, I mean, it's right there in front of your face. I told you who BreadTube works for, and there you have it, folks. I mean, this needs to be pointed out. So I just wanted to go there. But now that we're over that, all Vosh clips are done, so you can look back at your television if you're a person who gets sick to their stomach when they see Vosh. All Voshism is finished on this stream. We're going to talk now about capitalist crisis, because that's very important, because we are entering a prolonged period of a capitalist economic crisis. That's what we are entering as a society, as a country, as a world, basically. The capitalist system is entering a prolonged economic crisis. And when capitalist economic crises happen, there are certain developments that we should all be aware of. And so I wanted to start out by reading you a quote from Marx, which I think is really, really important. Really, really important quote. This is from Marx. Karl Marx wrote, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living." And that's from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, written by Karl Marx in 1851. That's a very important quote, because a lot of people read Marxism in an economic determinist way. They read Marxism and they say it'll just naturally happen, right? Capitalism naturally emerged from feudalism. Feudalism naturally emerged from slavery. Slavery naturally emerged from hunter-gatherer situations. And it just kind of naturally happens. There's nothing for us to do. Just sit back and watch it happen. Eventually, the workers are going to be so hungry that they're going to rise up and seize the means of production. Just like under feudalism, the peasants got so mad and the Silk Road emerged and the mercantile classes, and eventually feudalism was overturned, and history just kind of naturally takes its course. Economic determinism, that there is no free will, right? People don't make their own choices. There's no room for bravery. There's no room for heroism. There's no room for a dynamic role by any individual. The choices you make have no impact. We all just kind of sit back, and history just kind of naturally works. People work in their own economic interests. That is economic determinism. And Marx was not an economic determinist. I just read to you what Marx said. He said, men make their own history. Well, if men make their own history, it's not just inevitable. It's not just naturally going to happen. Men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered and given and transmitted from the past. Meaning, we work with the deck of cards we've been dealt. You and I, we're alive in this year in 2022. We are living our lives at this time, in this place, right? We can't change that. But what we do about the circumstances that we're in matters, and that historical forces that are already in motion can be pushed, right? And this is where we get into the confusion. So you have one deviation. A lot of these people that are into economic determinism, that's where you get Bernstein, this idea that capitalism just kind of naturally turns into socialism. The movement is everything, the goal is nothing, that, one day, I've had people that advocate this kind of politics, revisionism, the politics of Edward Bernstein, and they say, eventually we're going to have socialism, but it'll be one little brick at a time. And, first we'll have free healthcare, and next we'll have guaranteed jobs, and next we'll, have free college, and next there'll be some workers' councils here. And after about 50, 60 years of gradually one thing changing at a time, it'll be socialism. And we won't call it that, and it'll just happen gradually. And there's going to be no event horizon. There's not going to be any line where we cross into socialism. It's just kind of naturally going to emerge from capitalism. And that is Bernstein revisionism. And I remember this stuff was being promoted a lot during the Bush years. I remember I went to a number of workshops at the U.S. Social Forum where members of the Communist Party USA, members of the Committees of Correspondence, and members of the DSA were pushing this. They talked about defeating the right wing on the road to socialism, and that the idea was it would just gradually happen. It would just gradually happen. Dialect going, right? That was the idea, right? Writing down the super chat. Thank you, David. That's one deviation. But then you have another deviation, which is this deviation that we're going to create socialism by our will, right? And that is a deviation as well. Writing it down. This idea that it's not about historical conditions. It's not about material forces. It's not about sentiments and movements that are already there. It's that we just have to get a bunch of people together and go, ugh, a bunch of people that will it, that are so dedicated and with our passion that we can make it happen. And that's where you get left adventurism. Terrorists, right? They think, I'm going to go out and do something so exciting and heroic, it'll make it happen. Or you get extremist elements, or you get ultra leftist groups that they're not worried about actually tapping into sentiments among the population. They're not worried about actually making things happen. They just say, we are going to be so revolutionary and we are going to make ourselves feel revolutionary. We're going to go do something. And out of our oomph, out of our will, we are going to create the revolution that is needed. And that is also a deviation. That's not how Marxists operate. Marx says men make their own history, but they don't do it. They don't do it. What's the quote? Men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. You cannot will things that are not there. However, you have to look at what is actually there and figure out how you maneuver within it. That is the role. Marxist job is to look at the class forces in society, look at the economic conditions, look at the trends that exist among the population, and think about, with our limited resources, with our limited organization, with our limited voice and our capabilities, how can we intervene to push the forces that are already there in a direction to get done what needs to be done? That is the Marxist method, right? The peasant rebellions in China were already happening. Mao did not create the peasant rebellions. He didn't create the peasant uprisings. Mao knew about them. He knew they were happening. And he went to Hunan and he saw that it wasn't Mao who was making the peasants rise up. The conditions in the countryside were sparking these peasant uprisings. And Mao was telling that, he had the brilliance to tell the Chinese Communist Party, if we tap in and we maneuver to become the leaders of the coming peasant uprising, then we can have socialism. Right? Mao didn't go around and say, all right, we're going to tell all the peasants to rise up. No, the peasants were already rising up. There was already peasant uprisings. Mao studied the history of the Taiping Rebellion. Mao studied the history of previous peasant uprisings. He understood the nature of peasant uprisings in China. He understood the Chinese peasantry. And he was from the countryside. And he figured, okay, there's going to be this explosion among the peasantry. How can we maneuver within the forces that are already there in order to get what we want? That's the Marxist method. You're not just assuming it'll naturally happen. You're not giving up history's challenge. You're not giving up your ability to intervene in the historical process on the one hand. On the other hand, you're not, falling into the delusion that it's all just about you, right? And that it doesn't matter what's in the real material world. All that matters is just how dedicated we are, right? You have a realistic sense of who you are, what you're capable of doing. And with that realistic sense of self and what you're capable of doing, you can intervene. And so it's important to be clear, about the role of Marxists, right? On the one hand, material conditions are what is the driving force of history. However, Marxists are those who understand the objective laws of history. and intervene in order to drive history forward. They take up history's challenge. They take up history's challenge. That's the way Marxists used to talk. They used to say, we take up the challenge of history. And that, taking up the challenge of history, that is what we were doing, right? I see there's a super chat on Rockfin. I'm on Rockfin right now. Let me see. I like your take on the Dutch farmers. However, aren't food shortages a crisis of overproduction? All right, I'm writing it down, Johnny. All right, writing it down. So there you go. So what is happening in the world today? What is happening? Now, I become a little bit repetitive on a lot of these streams. That's okay, because the concepts that we're talking about here, nobody is talking about. Nobody talks about the concepts we talk about. So the fact that we talk about them a lot and that we repeat ourselves, that's okay, because no one else is doing it. It might be boring to us because we're hearing it all the time, but among the broad masses, nobody is talking about the built-in problems of capitalism. No one's talking about it. So it's important for us to be able to explain it, right? We need to be able to explain to people the built-in problems of capitalism. And it's important because no one else is explaining it. If you listen to your typical internet socialist, your typical DSA bread tuber, their understanding of the problem with capitalism is some people have more money than others, and it's not fair. Some people own the factory, some people work in the factory, and it's not fair. That's kindergarten stuff. That's kindergarten communism, and it's not really Marxism, right? That's during. That's utopian socialism. That's kindergarten stuff. That's not scientific Marxism. Scientific Marxism, first of all, understands that history is going through stages. First, we have primitive communalism. Then after that, we have slavery. And then after that, we have feudalism. And then out of feudalism comes capitalism. And the understanding is that out of capitalism emerges socialism. So that's the first thing. We understand history is moving forward, moving toward a higher, more efficient mode of production, that human beings are tool makers. Human beings are creatures that want more than they already have. And that is something unique about mankind, right? Ants have been building their ant farms the same way for millions of years. Beavers have been making their beaver dams the same way for millions of years. But in just a very, very, very short time, human beings have gone from hunter-gatherers in the woods to space travel and iPhones. And this is a very, very unique thing about the human species. We are constantly reinventing the way we interact with our environment. For example, if 40 years ago, just 40 years ago, right? 6 years before I was born, just 40 years ago, there were a bunch of minerals in Africa that were completely worthless. No one gave a shit about them. In the Central African Republic, in the Congo, and places like that, there were these minerals that were in the mountains. People knew what they were, and they were on the periodic table, and people knew what they were, and they didn't give a shit. No one cared. It was like, who cares about that? But then computer technology advanced, and new types of computer chips were invented. And now, these minerals that were completely worthless before are very, very valuable because the way we interact with our environment has changed, right? We have new forms of technology. We have new forms of computer chips, and those computer chips there are really valuable. That is what I'm talking about, that we human beings, at one point people were burning charcoal, right? And you go to Haiti. Most Haitians heat their homes, cook their food with charcoal. Well, now in the West, we use natural gas. We use natural gas or electric stoves, right? That the way we interact with our environment is constantly changing. We constantly are reinventing our relationship with nature, right? That is the way human beings tend to exist. The whole history of human civilization is the constant reinvention of our relationship with our environment. And as we reinvent our relationship with our environment, as the ways that we produce things like housing and food and shelter and entertainment, and as the economic base of society changes, right, the systems, the social systems we live under also change, right? This is Marxism, right? So that's the basis. And so we now live under capitalism, the system of capitalism. And what is wrong with capitalism? the problem with capitalism is that capitalism is outmoded. Capitalism, when it first came along, it was great, right? It did, it advanced technology in ways feudalism had only dreamed of. It brought a new level of freedom with it, right? Under capitalism, people suddenly had the right to freedom of religion and freedom of speech. They'd never had that before in feudalism, right? New inventions were coming along, electricity and steam engines and railroads. Capitalism was an advance over what was there before. That doesn't mean it wasn't doing awful, evil things as it emerged. We talk about primitive accumulation, right? But regardless, as capitalism emerged, it was an advance over what was there before. However, now capitalism is holding back human productivity. Right now, capitalism is preventing human beings from achieving their full potential. We need to advance to the next stage. And why is capitalism holding back human potential? I'm going to quickly go over the problems with capitalism. Problem number one: production organized for profit, not for social use. I'll tell a story about that. Years ago, when I was a college student, I did not have very much money, but I did have a girlfriend. And so me and my girlfriend, when I was in college, we used to go to the movies. We would go to the movies. So one time, didn't have that much money. Me and my girlfriend, we went to the movies. We went into the movie theater. We bought our tickets. We were inside the movie theater. And I thought, I'd really like to have some unnamed diet beverage to go with my movie, right? Didn't even want to think about getting any popcorn, but I figured I wanted to get some unnamed diet beverage. So I went to the counter at the movie theater. Asked my girlfriend, do you want anything? She was fine. She didn't want anything. She said she could drink some water from the drinking fountain. So I went to the counter at the movie theater, and I said I would like a small soda, diet. So they went over to the machine. They put a little ice in it. They filled up my soda. They brought it over. And then they said, that'll be $5.50. And I was like, damn, that's a lot of money. $5.50 for just a soda? I looked in my wallet and I only had 3 $1 bills. So I pulled out the 3 $1 bills. I said, I've only got 3 $1 bills. They said, okay. So they took that soda that was already prepared, that cup that had already been filled up, they dumped it out, and then they threw the cup in the garbage. What sense does that make? They'd already ruined the cup. They couldn't use the cup again. They'd already filled it with soda and ice. Why in the world could they not give me that soda? Because I didn't pay for it. That's why. That soda wasn't created so I could have something nice to drink. That soda was created to make money for a capitalist. And that is the capitalist system. Production is organized for profit, not for social good. So yes, even though there was nothing for them to lose, that soda had already been created, they still threw it in the garbage because if they'd given it for free, then other people wouldn't buy sodas. And in order for them to not go out of business, they can't be giving free sodas away. And so they threw it in the garbage. Another great example, restaurants very frequently have a policy. At the end of the night, they throw food away, especially in big cities, New York City, Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco, places like that. Restaurants will throw food away at the end of the night. They have leftover food. It's going to be spoiled by the next day. They can't use it again. So they just put it in the garbage. But it's a very common practice that restaurant owners will have a bottle of motor oil. And before they throw that food in the garbage, they will take the motor oil and they will dump the motor oil all over it. Why? That's so homeless people don't take it out of the garbage. And you think, well, what would be wrong with that? Well, the reason is if those homeless people eat it out of the garbage, then they're not going to buy it. And those homeless people are out, begging on the street. They might get $1 here and $1 there. But if they don't have to spend it on food, they'll spend it on something else. So in order to make sure that those homeless people buy the loaf of bread from you, instead of getting the old loaf of bread out of the garbage, you got to pour motor oil on it. Because that loaf of bread wasn't created so people could eat it. That loaf of bread was created so that a capitalist could make profit off of it. Production is organized for profit, not for social good. That's capitalism. Another great example. Good friend of mine, Dakota Lilly. He was on the Tucker Carlson show, very pro-Venezuela guy, awesome, good guy. I knew him when he was a college student. In the middle of the winter, in freezing cold conditions, he documented that this store, I believe it was a store in Union Square, was taking winter coats that they could not sell and slicing them up with knives before throwing them in the garbage. Why? So no homeless person would take that nice warm winter coat out of the garbage and wear it, because they didn't make those coats so people could be warm. They made those coats so they could make profits. That's capitalism. Capitalism is production for profit, not for social use. And that is, by the way, the definition of capitalism. Production organized for profit. That is capitalism. The capitalist mode of production is production organized for profit. The anarchy of production, where you have economic institutions, banks, factories, industries, garment centers, oil wells, all these things function according to profit. That's capitalism. That's the first aspect of capitalism that is problematic. The second aspect of capitalism is what's called the general law of capitalist accumulation. And that is that if a capitalist enterprise is not growing, it is dying. That a capitalist must constantly, the capitalist enterprise makes profits, and then they take those profits and they reinvest them in expanding the enterprise. So they then get more profits, which they then reinvest in further expanding the enterprise. So they get more profits, and then they reinvest them and they reinvest them. And that's how capitalist enterprises work. The general law of capitalist accumulation being that the capitalist economy, the capitalist institution, must be growing. It must be getting more profits to reinvest, to get more profits, to reinvest, to get more profits, to reinvest, to get more profits. If a capitalist enterprise is not expanding itself, getting bigger, it dies. Expand or die is the general law of capitalist accumulation. That the capitalist is constantly looking to grow. If the capitalist, if Walmart stopped growing, Walmart is in the process of going out of business. If Kmart stops growing, then Kmart is in the process of going out of business, right? That this is how it works. If your business is not growing, your business is dying. Your business can't be stagnant under capitalism. It doesn't work that way. However, if businesses are constantly growing and constantly competing with each other, that creates a problem. Because if they keep expanding, they're going to step on each other and they're going to compete with each other. And the competition might be good for a while. It might lead to lower prices and better things for the consumers. But eventually, one of those companies is going to go out of business. And another company is going to go out of business. And pretty soon, after this general law of capitalist accumulation plays out, you're going to end up with what's called a monopoly. And when you have a monopoly, expansion stops. And you have what's called monopolistic stagnation. And so the capitalists themselves, not the socialists, not the leftists, the capitalists themselves, have invented all kinds of mechanisms to try and prevent monopolistic stagnation, to try and prevent this process, right? For example, this problem of, the general law of capitalist accumulation. Thomas Jefferson, one of the founders of the United States, author of the Declaration of Independence. Okay. Wrote it down. One of the founders of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. In his writings, he talks about the yeoman. The yeoman. And he talks about how the ideal for America is this small farmer. This perfect small farmer who doesn't have any slaves and he doesn't have any hired employees. He just has his tract of land. He grows his crops. He sells them and no one bothers him. And he's a free settler. And that was a big part of Jefferson's populistic settler rhetoric. Jefferson was a settler populist. And in reality, Jefferson was working for the slave owners. He was a supporter of the Southern slave owners, but in his rhetoric, he was for the little guy, the yeoman, the small farmer. But why is Jefferson's theory about the yeoman bullshit? Why? Because of the general law of capitalist accumulation. That, yeah, for a while you might have one small farmer here, one small farmer there, and they all just have their little tract of land. But then pretty soon there's going to be a drought. And some of those farmers' crops are going to fail. And when that happens, when the drought comes along and those farmers' crops fail, there's going to be some farmers that will have crops and some who won't. And so what's going to happen? Those individual small farmers who still have crops are going to use their money to buy up the farms of those farmers whose crops failed. And pretty soon, some of those farmers on those individual farms that went out of business are going to be working as hired employees on a much bigger farm owned by the farmers whose crops didn't fail. And eventually, this yeoman situation, if you let it play out long enough, it's going to lead to a huge bunch of, a huge amount of land owned by a small group of landowners who have a lot of employees. That it's not you can't permanently maintain that. And that's what a lot of libertarians believe. They believe, they have this in their mind, this image of this little town where people go out and vote with their dollars, and there's one little store, one ice cream shop, and there's another ice cream shop, and there's one clothing store, and another clothing store. That's only a fantasy. That's not reality. It doesn't work that way. Eventually, you have this problem of monopolies emerging. However, when the monopolies emerge, suddenly this mad drive for growth, the general law of capitalist accumulation, stops. And suddenly the monopoly's like, I don't give a shit. I can do whatever. I'm the monopoly. So the government has to step in and break apart the monopolies. Okay, writing it down. The government has to step in and break apart the monopolies to keep the competition going, or else the growth that is the basis of the economy stops. Right? And thank you, Abidding, for your super sticker. And that is a big problem in capitalism. That's a very, very big problem in capitalism. And so the government has to, there's all these things, there's all these rules that we don't know about. Antitrust laws, for example. It's illegal. You are a Hollywood movie studio owner. If you own a Hollywood movie studio, you cannot own a movie theater. Did you know this? That there was actually a Chinese man, the owner of AMC is a Chinese capitalist, a Chinese owner of a corporation, AMC movie theaters, and he wanted to buy one of the Hollywood movie studios, and the courts said no, you can't. And why? Why would that happen? Why is it that that you can't own both a movie theater chain and a movie studio? Why can't you do that? Because if you owned the movie studios and you owned a movie theater chain, your theaters would only show your movies. That would be common sense. Why would you help your competitors by showing their movies at your movie theater? And if you got to a situation where certain movie theaters only showed the movies by the studio that owned them, pretty soon you're going to have a monopoly, and there's not going to be competition. And so there's all kinds of mechanisms that are built into capitalism. I used to work in insurance. I was never, I worked in insurance, and I was never a full-on, I never became a licensed insurance salesman, but I worked and I assisted insurance salespeople, people who sold insurance. And I learned from the insurance industry, there's all kinds of mechanisms to make sure that people don't do that, right? For example, right? One thing you cannot do, it is a crime, you can go to jail for doing it, is if you're an insurance salesman and you say, hey, you say to your friend, if you buy your insurance from me, I'll give you some of the money back. That's illegal. If you do that, you can go to jail. Why? Because then your friend is only going to buy his insurance from you because he's going to get a kickback from you. That's illegal, right? You can't do that. There are all kinds of things built in to prevent the emergence of monopolies, because monopolies are the natural results of the general law of capitalist accumulation. Capitalist corporations have to concentrate their power. And the way the antitrust laws are generally set up, most industries, there's 3 or 4 big names, right? There's 7 big Hollywood movie studios. There's 3 or 4 major banks. There's 4 super major oil companies: ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron. The way that capitalist monopolies tend to work is that you get 3 or 4 big companies that get to be part of the club, and the rest just kind of get locked out. And Max the Sax is asking, all right, unique anti-communism That's the second problem with capitalism. Third problem with capitalism is the problem of overproduction, that the worker can never buy back the product he produces. The coal miner's riddle, right? The classic coal miner's riddle, right? The little boy is cold. He says, "Father, why is it so cold?" And the father says, "It's cold because I can't afford to buy any coal." And he says, "Why can't you buy any coal?" He says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine." He says, "Why did you lose your job at the coal mine, Dad?" And the father says, "Because there's too much coal. There's too much coal." And that is the problem of overproduction. Under capitalism, poverty is created by abundance. The more that is produced, the more food that is produced, the more people go hungry. The more housing that is created, the more homeless people there are, right? Only under, it seemed an absurdity, Karl Marx writes in the Communist Manifesto, but people are hungry because there's too much food. People are homeless because there are too many houses. The 2008 financial crisis, the housing bubble burst. Remember that? Alan Greenspan, and the housing bubble burst because Americans couldn't afford to keep buying houses. They'd produced so much housing, and Americans couldn't afford to keep buying housing at the same rate. And Alan Greenspan had desperately tried to keep Americans spending money so that they could keep the housing market going. And eventually the easy credit and the rip-off loans that he'd approved, they fell through. And eventually it got to the point that the housing bubble burst. People became homeless because there are too many houses. The housing bubble burst. So we have the problem of overproduction. That's the third problem with the capitalist economy, is it leads to crises of overproduction, where so much wealth is created that the workers can't afford to buy it back, and the economy comes to a grinding halt. Fourth issue is the tendency of the falling rate of profit. So not only is it bad for the workers that they can't afford to buy back the product that they're producing, but on top of that, you have the tendency of the falling rate of profit, which is the capitalist is constantly using technology to try and eliminate the worker from the assembly line. The fewer workers that are hired, the more profits the capitalist gets to make, except the capitalist can only extract surplus value from the worker. He cannot extract any value from the machines. He cannot extract any value from the materials. So the less that workers are involved in production, the more that the role of the worker in production goes down, the less the rate of profits that the capitalist makes. This is called the tendency of the falling rate of profits, or the tendency of the rate of profits to fall. And all of these things show that capitalism is ultimately holding back human productivity. In a rational society, self-driving cars would be a great thing, because that would mean that we would have less work to be done. People who have to spend their days driving people around, truck drivers, cab drivers, delivery people, none of them would need to do that. They could do something productive. Self-driving cars would be a great thing in a rational society. But under capitalism, self-driving cars would mean mass poverty, because all the people who make their living and sell their labor power as truck drivers, or as Uber drivers, or as delivery men, or as cab drivers would lose their jobs, right? And this is the problem of capitalism. This is the problem of capitalism. Capitalism is holding back human potential. Capitalism is not capable of having endless growth. It has the general law of capitalist accumulation leading to monopolistic stagnation. It has the problem of overproduction. It has the problem of production for profit, not for social use. It has the tendency of the falling rate of profit. All of this is why the capitalist system doesn't work. and that a prolonged capitalist economic crisis emerges when there are great leaps in technology. It used to be there was a capitalist crisis of overproduction, a capitalist crisis of the tendency of the falling rate of profit every couple of years. Go back to the Gilded Age, the 1880s, the 1890s. They were having what they called panics on the stock market all the time. And that's why J.P. Morgan invented the Federal Reserve Bank to pump money in and out of the economy to try and stabilize it. And they had stock ownership corporations. All kinds of mechanisms have been invented to try and prevent the chronic instability of the capitalist system. However, when you have a huge leap in technology, the result is going to be a huge economic crisis. World War I came after huge technological leaps that led to economic crises, that led to political problems, that led to a big war. And on top of that, World War II came after. You had the Roaring Twenties, you had Fordism and assembly line innovation and all these leaps in technological progress and making production more efficient than ever. And then that led to the Great Depression, which led to political turmoil, which ultimately led to the Second World War. That the instability of capitalism and technological leaps lead to prolonged economic crises. And prolonged economic crises tend to have certain results. And I want to talk about, there are two things that develop during prolonged economic crises. They're very important because we're going to see both of them. We're already seeing, to some degree or other, both of them, but we're going to see them soon. There are two tendencies that develop during a prolonged economic capitalist crisis. Now, this is a quote from the Communist Manifesto, and I've read it all to you. I've read it to you all before, and I'm going to read it to you all again. And I read it last night, and I read it to you all before, but I'm going to read it to you again because it bears repeating because it's important. This is the first thing that tends to happen during capitalist economic crises. I mean, it's not the first thing, actually. I mean, in our case, it's happening a little bit later than the other thing, but it's a really important development, right? This happens during economic crises. So I'm going to read to you what happens. The growing competition among the bourgeois and the resulting commercial crises makes the wages of workers ever more fluctuating, and the increasing improvement of machinery, ever more rapidly developing, makes their livelihood more and more precarious. The collision between the individual workman and the individual bourgeois take more and more the character of collisions between two classes. Thereupon, the workers begin to form combinations against the bourgeoisie. Now, in most translations of the Communist Manifesto, they follow the word combinations with, in parenthesis, they write trade unions. That's not correct, in my view. Trade unions are just one manifestation of this, but let me continue. Thereupon, the workers begin to form combinations against the bourgeoisie. They club together in order to keep up the rate of wages. They found permanent associations in order to make provisions beforehand for these occasional revolts. Here and there, the contest breaks out into riots, and now and then the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of their battle lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of workers. The union is helped by means of communication. What does this mean? That when there's an economic crisis, workers are getting poorer and poorer, their wages are fluctuating more and more, their lives are becoming less and less stable, and they think, we got to depend on each other. We got to start taking care of each other. And that's what workers do. And they form labor unions to join arm in arm and fight the bosses on the job. That's one version of it. They form unemployed associations to care for the unemployed, to put pressure on the government to increase the social programs, to increase food benefits and social welfare programs. They form community groups that kind of take care of people. Often they're criminal organizations that are formed. Gangs are formed. Criminal gangs are formed. Religious organizations are formed. But the workers have to come together and start taking care of each other because it gets so bad that on their own, they're fucked, right? And so as a result, suddenly people aren't joining organizations because they feel like it. People aren't joining a club because it sounds like a fun club to be part of. People are joining a group of other workers to survive. right? That's how it gets. As the economic crisis intensifies, we're in the early stages of the economic crisis right now. Keep in mind, we're not full blown there yet. This is the beginning of a prolonged economic crisis. We're seeing the beginning of this. But you look at Skid Row. You think those homeless people in those Skid Row's encampments, you think they don't have associations? You think they don't have alliances? Do you think there aren't, homeless people that take care of other homeless people? You think there aren't homeless people there that they go and get something and then they share it with other people? They have to, because in those conditions on Skid Row and those huge encampments of homeless people outside of Los Angeles, they can't survive on their own. And so they form a combination. Now, these combinations emerge among the workers as a result of the conditions. And labor unions, the labor movement, is a very important manifestation of it. But in the United States, labor unions have a particular legal status, right? So I think that when people see that in the Communist Manifesto and it says labor unions after it, they're missing the point, which is that you can't afford to be an individualist if you're starving, right? Everyone thinks they can be an individualist if they got a lot of money and they could get their little place and their fancy house and they could be all on their own and all of that. If you're starving, if you're desperately poor, people learn to take care of each other. And anyone who's from the developing world can tell you that. Even among people in the developing world that are comfortable, there's much more of a sense of we got to take care of each other. You go to Asia, you go to Africa, you go to South and Central America, people take care of each other because they have to, because the economic conditions that have been there for generations have said, you can't do this on your own. Family becomes much more important. Poor people. Why is it that so many poor people are deeply religious and in some cases anti-gay or transphobic or very much committed to what they might call family values? Because family is a very important thing when you're struggling, right? If you're a rich kid and you just, it's like whatever, but if you're struggling, you have to have somebody who can help you take care of people, right? Tyler McConnell's referencing the Grapes of Wrath. They talk about this in the Grapes of Wrath. Go and read the Grapes of Wrath. So that's the first thing that tends to develop in times of economic crisis. When economic situations get very, very bad, you get combinations emerging among the workers. And during the Great Depression, we had the unemployed councils. You had the Nation of Islam among the Black community. You had Father Divine among the Black community. You had all kinds of the farm cooperatives that out there in the Midwest. You had the Grange and all these farmers that would come together and take care of each other. And there were whole networks of people because they were starving. And when you're starving, you have to learn to take care of each other. All right, I'm going to write this super chat down. Okay. All right. Very good. Wrote it down. All right. So that's the first thing, is the combinations. The second thing that develops is Bonapartism. Bonapartism. And again, these are things that naturally develop. Those combinations, they're not created by communists, right? It's not communists going out there and saying, let's get together, guys. And no, there's some of that. But even if that didn't happen, people would still have to do this. There would be religious groups that would come together and start taking care of people. There would be gangs and criminal organizations that would come together and start taking care of people. There would be unemployed associations. There would be labor, people on the job, getting together and just kind of in a basic way saying to the boss, we're not going in today if you don't treat us better. There would be more of that. This is natural, right? This is not the will of revolutionaries. These are things that just naturally develop. When you have a prolonged economic crisis, you get combinations among the working class. The working class is forced out of necessity to start forming combinations and becoming more collectivist and less individualist in order to survive. Go out to Indiana these days. Indiana is a very poor state, and heroin is a big problem. And there's heroin gangs. There's some heroin gangs that are aligned, that are Nazi in their ideology. The Vinlander Social Club is a Nazi gang, and then there's anti-racist ones that support Antifa that are fighting the Vinlander Social Club. Right? You can go out there. And again, are these people that are deeply ideological? No, these are people that are very, very poor and they're struggling to get by. And in order to struggle to get by, they join a criminal organization of some kind. And these kind of things happen, right? And the same, this is what happens when you have an economic crisis. Is naturally, in order to survive, working people form combinations. That's the first thing. And the next thing that happens naturally is called Bonapartism, is that the capitalists are desperately wanting to stabilize the country. They want the economy to get better. The capitalists, their profits are going down. Maybe they don't give a shit about the workers, but they give a shit about the fact their profits are going down. They give a shit about the hunger riots that are taking place where the poor people are going out and breaking into things. They give a shit about the instability in society. They give a shit about that. And so the capitalists are thinking, okay, we obviously need the government to step in. We need the government to step in and try and stabilize the economy. But there's a bit of a problem there because they all want the economy to get better. They'd all like the government to step in and stabilize the economy, but they don't want to pay for it. They want the other capitalists to pay for it, right? They're fine with the government stepping in and forcing the economy to do better, but they're not fine if they're the ones that have to pay for it. So you get factions in the ruling class fighting with each other about who gets their ass kicked by the government and who does the government take care of. And that becomes the fight in the ruling class. And the classic example, the reason we call it Bonapartism, is because in 1851, Karl Marx was living in Paris and he saw this firsthand. There was a capitalist economic crisis. There were strikes and rebellions among the workers. And the finance capitalists, the bankers, and the farmers teamed up with with Napoleon's nephew, Louis Bonaparte, and he declared himself the military dictator. Louis Bonaparte declared himself the military dictator. He had a military coup. He overthrew the government, and he established a military dictatorship. And with his military dictatorship, he tried to stabilize the economy. And he kicked the ass of the factory owners. The factory owners, the industrial capitalists, they were forced to have a 12-hour workday. And they were forced to pay higher taxes so he could build hospitals for poor people. And he started building railroads across France. And Louis Bonaparte wasn't a socialist by any means, but he was a Bonapartist, and he was a progressive Bonapartist in a lot of ways. He wasn't a full-on reactionary. He was an anti-communist, and he did put down the workers when they revolted. But his Bonapartist maneuvers were he built infrastructure, he built hospitals for poor people, he fought the industrial capitalists, and he tended to be more sympathetic to the labor unions. He created a 12-hour workday, but he did it by kicking the ass of his own class. There was a group that was against him, and they were called the Party of Order, and they were conservative guys who loved the factory owners. They were conservative dudes. They loved the factory owners. And so when Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon III came into power, those guys fled the country for their lives because he was going to line them all up and shoot them, right? He established a Bonapartist authoritarian regime to stabilize the capitalist economy, representing the financiers, the bankers, and representing the farmers. The farmers and the bankers teamed up to kick the ass of the factory owners. And if you read the 18th Bruyere of Louis Bonaparte, one of Karl Marx's most important works that is pretty much forgotten. People don't read this. It's a very important book. He talks about this. And he talks about how Louis Bonaparte created an army of desperately poor people, of lumpen proletarians, to go out and be like his supporters in the streets and to riot and stuff and support the military when it was marching to overthrow the government, etc. And that Louis Bonaparte was a strongman military dictator brought in by one section of the ruling class, one faction, to try and stabilize the economy at the expense of the other section of the ruling class. And that's what happens in capitalist crisis. And it doesn't work. It's temporary because at the end of the day, it's still production organized for profit. It's still the capitalist system. And yeah, you can have the government kick the ass of the factory owners. And yeah, you can have the government build some railroads and give poor people, hospitals. And yeah, you can. But at the end of the day, if it's still capitalism, you still have all the problems. Bonapartism is something that goes on during economic crises. A great example of Bonapartism in American history, a very, very great example of that would be Woodrow Wilson. In the lead up to World War I, the USA was having instability and economic crises. So Woodrow Wilson came into office and he saw that it was necessary to use the government to try and stabilize the economy. And Woodrow Wilson, he realized that in order to try and stabilize the economy and use the government to stabilize the economy, he was going to need to have a mass movement. So Woodrow Wilson created the Ku Klux Klan, right? The Ku Klux Klan had existed after the Civil War among Confederates, but it had been wiped out by Ulysses S. Grant. He sent the military to wipe it out. Woodrow Wilson had Hollywood, which was very new back then, make the first full-length movie in the history of the United States. And it was called The Birth of a Nation. And it was a white supremacist, racist film all about how the Republicans, the Republican Party had betrayed the white people and the black people of the South, and it was called The Birth of a Nation. And it was all about, white supremacism. And among rural people in the Midwest, in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Illinois, a lot of the small farmers tended to vote for the Republican Party. But then they saw this racist propaganda film about how the Republican Party had sold out the white people for the blacks. And they were told by the Ku Klux Klan that Roman Catholics drink alcohol and are all agents of the Vatican and are trying to threaten American security. So Woodrow Wilson built this mass, pseudo-populist racist movement in order to force his will onto the Democratic Party, to take votes away from the Republicans. The Republicans were accused of being the party of black people, the party of Lincoln, and to suppress the urban political machines, which tend to be run by Roman Catholics. Tammany Hall in New York City, the machine in Philadelphia, elsewhere. The urban political machines that had a lot of Italian and Irish and Eastern European immigrants who were Catholic in them. The Ku Klux Klan took over the Democratic Party, and Woodrow Wilson was using the Ku Klux Klan to try and be the military strongman of the United States and stabilize the capitalist economy. And then World War I broke out, and he basically declared a state of martial law in the United States. And they outlawed the Socialist Party and threw the socialists in prison. The IWW was thrown in jail. Eugene Debs was thrown in jail for opposing World War I. And then they drafted everyone into the military. And then they had these people who went around walking the streets looking for seditious orators, basically trying to monitor the streets for anyone who would be against the war. And they outlawed strikes because the strikes would hurt the war production. And during World War I, the USA was basically a Bonapartist regime under the leadership of Woodrow Wilson, who was a racist, who was a white supremacist, and the U.S. government, in the name of defeating the Germans and winning the war and keeping the world safe for democracy, you had the Ku Klux Klan, and then you had, a full-on military dictatorship during the war. The socialist movement was crushed, and you had Bonapartism to stabilize the U.S. economy. Roosevelt was also a Bonapartist. He was a progressive Bonapartist, right? He aligned with the labor unions and the Rockefellers, the oil companies, to fight against the factory owners that were sympathetic to fascism. And Roosevelt hired the unemployed to build highways and bridges, the Works Progress Administration. And Roosevelt created Social Security, and the factory owners hated Roosevelt. They considered him to be a communist, and they tried to have a fascist coup to overthrow him. This is what happens in a capitalist economic crisis. In good times in capitalism, what Ronald Reagan said, we're all friends after 6, is very true. All the politicians are on the same team, right? They're all on the same team, and they're all working together, and they don't care, and it's just a big show. But that's during good times. But during bad times, suddenly the capitalists are at each other's throats because it's a capitalist crisis, right? CPI should do a book on Marx and Lincoln. Because it's a capitalist crisis, they suddenly are at each other's throats. And that's what's happening now. And that's what January 6th was about. And that's what the raid on Donald Trump's home was about. And that's what the Stop Trump movement and their fight there. Again, there's a capitalist crisis, and we're seeing Bonapartism. All of these things that I just described, I just told you where the capitalist crisis comes from. The problem of overproduction, production organized for profit, tendency of the falling rate of profit, as well as the general law of capitalist accumulation. That's the roots of the crisis. But then the crisis leads to combinations among the workers, number one, and Bonapartism among the capitalists. The job of revolutionaries is to intervene, to turn the combinations among the workers and the Bonapartism among the capitalists, to intervene and turn it into a socialist revolution. That is our job. How, as the capitalists fight with each other, how can we intervene to push it in a good direction, number one? And as the workers are forming combinations, how can we intervene and make those combinations something that can rise up and take power? right? And that's what Karl Marx was getting at. Men make their own history, but they don't make it as they please. They work with the deck of cards they've been dealt. And we're entering the biggest and longest capitalist crisis that has ever happened, because no technological leap in history has been anywhere near as big as the computer revolution. What they are doing now with artificial intelligence, what they are doing now with 3D printers, what they are doing now with so many things. I mean, you think about self-driving cars. I mean, we are headed for a very deep and prolonged economic crisis. Capitalism can't handle the computer revolution. There's no room for the workers. The human population is bigger than it's ever been. However, the capitalists need less workers to run their industries than ever before. This is the perfect storm. This is the Gotterdammerung. This is exactly what Karl Marx was writing about. If you read what Karl Marx wrote about, Marx basically predicted this. This is basically, if you read the Communist Manifesto, if you read Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, if you read Capital, if you read Theories of Surplus Value, if you read Grundrisse, Poverty of Philosophy, this is what Karl Marx was talking about. That capitalism would lead to a situation where the capitalist needs fewer and fewer workers to create products. The role of productive labor in the economy is constantly diminishing. And as a result of that, the working class would be forced into greater and greater poverty. And eventually, there would be so much poverty among the workers and so much instability in the economy that the workers and their combinations would get together and they would seize the means of production. They would take control of the government and win the battle for democracy. And then from there, they would centralize the means of production and have a rationally organized economy. That is Marxism. What I just told you, that's Marxism, is that the contradictions of capitalism and the drive of technology and the general law of capitalist accumulation would lead to a prolonged economic crisis that capitalism could not overturn. And as a result of that, the workers would have no choice but to rise up and seize the means of production. That's Marxism. What I just told you, that is Marxism. That is scientific socialism. That's very different than some people have a lot of money and some people don't, and that's not fair. It's very different than somebody owns the factory and somebody works there, and that's not fair. What I'm telling you here, this is real Marxism. That's what I'm teaching you here. This is real Marxism. This is the scientific, dialectical, historical, materialist understanding of history. That's what I just told you. And what our job is to figure out, amid the workers forming their combinations and amid the Bonapartism among the capitalists, how can we, with our meager resources, how can we, with our meager forces and our voice, our small voice, how can we maneuver within all of this to push the workers to take up the historical task, to take up history's challenge and create socialism? How do we do it? Well, an important part of that is going to be the socialist countries that already exist, right? It's going to be China. It's going to be Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua. It's going to be it's not just the socialist countries, but it's the countries that are basically part of them, right? I mean, Russia, you could say Russia's not a socialist country anymore, right? The Communist Party is not in power. There's a lot of private capitalists, but Russia's economy is so dependent on trade with China, so tied in with socialism in Latin America, so tied in with socialism in Vietnam. I mean, it's like, okay, so maybe they're not, but they're functioning as part of the emerging block of countries that is centered around socialism, right? Okay, so maybe Russia isn't socialist, but they're part of the socialist bloc. And so even if your economy is technically not socialist, even if your government doesn't believe in Marxism, if you're that closely tied in to the socialist bloc, and if you're that heavily locked out of the capitalist bloc like Russia is right now, I mean, does it matter? Does it really matter? The role that Russia is going to play in the world is going to be a progressive one, and they're going to be aligned with the socialist countries. Communists around the world love Russia. And I just want to get this out there because it annoys me, right? I always get all these people like, oh, why does any communist love Russia? It's like, dude, get out of America, get out of Western Europe, talk to any communists outside of your liberal Western bubble. They all love Russia. They all love Russia. The communists in Venezuela love Russia. Communists in Nicaragua, they love Russia. The communists in Vietnam, they love Russia. The communists in China love Russia. The big communist parties in Africa, in Angola, the MPLA, they love Russia. The Communist Party of India, Marxist, that runs Kerala in India, has millions of members. They love Russia, right? The communists in Zimbabwe, they love Russia. I met, it's just like, I'm sorry, but it's like, where communists actually matter, and they aren't this like fringe internet thing. They're not like this community of people on Twitter who think that Republicans are Nazis and are like obsessed with the trans issue. When communists are like they're like real organizations of millions of people with trade unions, with members of parliament elected, they love Russia. When they are running the government, like in Vietnam and in Angola and in Zimbabwe, when they're part of the ruling coalition, like they are in South Africa, they love Russia. Okay, I mean that's just a fact. And that's what we need to get down to. And pointing out that Russia is not our enemy, pointing out that China is not our enemy, supporting Venezuela, supporting Iran, that's going to be a big part of this, because there are going to be capitalists. Part of the Bonapartist struggle that's going to go on is going to be that there's going to be a lot of capitalists who don't benefit from fighting with China. They say, hey, I want to make money trading with China. A friend of mine works at the airport. He was telling me before the pandemic, he was always meeting wealthy Southern dude who's just been to China, right? Wealthy Southern conservative Trump supporting dude who loves China. That guy, he met him like 20 times. He met a guy like that. And he'd be a Southern conservative right-wing Trump supporter who'd walk in and be like, I was just in China and it's amazing. China's amazing. They're hardworking. Things are growing. Wow, I want America to be just like China. He met that guy many, many times. Many times he met him. Listen to Jim Rogers, the legendary investor based in Singapore. There's a big section of the capitalist class that is seeing Nancy Pelosi go to Taiwan and is going, fuck, come on. There's so much money to be made trading with China. And there's a big section of the capitalist class that wants to do business with Russia. And they're like, okay, yeah, whatever, can we just stop this Ukraine stuff? Because we could, that's a lot of the Bonapartism. Why do you think they're always accusing Trump of being a Russian agent? They see Trump as being tied in with a section of the capitalist class that is more sympathetic to Russia. He may not even be that, but that's what they perceive him as being. Why are the Democrats always being accused of being agents of China by Republicans? Why? Because of the fact that Republicans see Democrats as being part of a section of the ruling class that wants to trade with China, right? And that these differences exist among the capitalists. These differences exist. And that's the Bonapartism that we're seeing. They're raiding Trump's home and January 6th and Russiagate and all this. This is what it's about, folks. This is what it's about. I mean, there is division in the ruling class. That's what it's about. All right, wrote it down. And as the workers are forming combinations, it's going to be our job to go to those combinations and give them an ideology to believe in. The workers are going to form the combinations of themselves. They're going to have to. It's going to be a necessity. But as Lenin writes in What Is to Be Done, left to their own devices, they're only capable of developing a short-term trade union consciousness. The combinations are coming. They're already here in some parts of the country, but they're not based on anything. But our job as scientific socialists and those who understand this is to make these combinations into conscious revolutionary organizations. When the workers come together and they form a union, or they form an unemployed association, or they start taking care of each other, or they form a criminal group, or they form a religious group, our job as communists is to go to those combinations and make those combinations revolutionary. That's our job. Our job is to maneuver within the divisions in the ruling class. Our job is to go to the combinations and make them conscious and revolutionary, not just people like, hey, we got to take care of each other, but also give them an ideology to believe in. That's what our job is. How do we do that? How do we develop strategies to do that? How do we get people to understand actual scientific Marxism? How do we do it? Well, our work is cut out for us. I think we're doing the best we can at CPI. We've had some great steps forward recently, and we're doing the best we can. And those are my opening remarks for tonight. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell, and let's start doing the roll call. Names and locations, names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. Names and locations. And then I will start answering your super chat questions. So there we go. So names and locations. And then we'll start answering super chats, and that'll be our show. So if there's something else you want me to talk about in the second half of the show, better send me a super chat. And who's with us tonight? I see the great Chris Morlock is in San Francisco. Shout out to you, Chris. All right, I see Tristan in Maryland is with us. Shout out to you, Tristan. Vicky. Tristan gave a great class at one of our retreats, by the way. I can't wait till it's posted. We got Antonio. Shout out to you, Antonio. New Jersey bound. Respect, sir. All right. Lady Alex in Albuquerque. Bradley Wasser in St. Louis. Mohsen from Iran. Shout out to you, Mohsen. Noblesville, Indiana. Valen in Richmond, Virginia. High Level, Alberta, Canada. Tyler from Salem, Missouri. Mark from Tacoma, Washington. Chase from H-Town. We got Gordy in Oakland. We got Richard Thunder in Perth. We got Zard in Denmark. We got Heidi in Edinburgh. We got Goiás in Brazil. Goiás. We got Michigan, A Better America in Michigan. We got Richard in Woodland, California. We got Ryan in Oakland. Class analysis. Ryan is with us. St. David's, Bermuda. We got John McCarthy in the socialist capital of Seattle. That's true. The Communist Party USA wanted Chicago to be the capital of the country. Mark in Mission, Texas. AJ in Chicago. Marissa in Washington. Shout out to you, Marissa. You were at the retreat. It was awesome. We got Mark in Utica, New York is with us. We got Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati. We got David Fox, who's out in Australia. We got Jeremy from Chicago, Illinois. We got Trenton, New Jersey. Louis is with us. Raleigh, North Carolina. Mr. Camera is with us. Northern Arizona. Chester, England. Ian Foster. Very, very good. Very, very good. Marcos from Valencia, Venezuela. Micah from Las Vegas. Northern Arizona. Mike Pino. Mo and Danielle in Pomona, California. Chris in Bryan, Texas is with us. Jay in Maryland is with us. Very, 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 very good. Good to have you all here today. Dust James, the great Dust James. He spoke at our conference. His talk is going to be posted soon. Dust James is awesome. Working Class Revolt, Anti-Imperialist America. Go subscribe to Dust James' channel. Mo and Danielle in Pomona, California. Good stuff. Good stuff. Gabby in Chicago. Gabby is awesome. Gabby is so awesome. Gabby is great. Anybody else with us today? Caitlin from Chicago. Glad to finally meet you at the CPI conference. Caitlin, yes, so good to meet you. And it was an eye-opening experience. I agree. Very good. Kieran from San Diego. Good stuff. Escondido, California. Sammy Scheller. Very, very good. Phil in Miami. Welcome, Phil. Welcome, Phil. All righty. Now I'm going to start answering super chat questions. If you have a super chat question you would like me to answer, send it. I will write it down. You'll go to the bottom of the list, and we'll just keep going. So the first one is from it's from David Fox. He said, Stalin on dialectical and historical materialism in reference to the capitalist crisis. My understanding is that Stalin wrote the chapter on dialectical materialism that is in the History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union short course. That's a really important book to read. History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union short course. And I believe Stalin himself wrote the chapter on dialectical materialism. But also, if I'm not mistaken, in this book that Stalin wrote, Anarchism or Socialism by Stalin, he starts out by talking about dialectical and historical materialism. So that's a good place to start as well. But yeah, this is a really easy read. It's a short pamphlet Stalin wrote, Anarchism or Socialism, critiquing the anarchist movement. And he starts out by explaining dialectical and historical materialism. But yeah, also, if you can read the History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union short course, that's a really important book to read. I think I've got it down here. I got the Red Star Publishers edition, History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, short course it's called. And it was published in 1936 as the official history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And if you read it, it gets into a lot of detail about, I believe there's a chapter on dialectical materialism that was written by Stalin. So there you go. There you go. All right. All right. Next question. Outcry forced the Ukrainian government to take down its hit list of journalists. Well, that's nice of them to take it down, but you think they aren't targeting those journalists? You think they don't want to kill those journalists still? I mean, it's kind of like it was stupid on their part to make it public, but I'm sure they still would like to murder those journalists. I'm sure they would still like to. I mean, it just shows you that, yeah, it's bad PR. It's bad PR to have a list of journalists you want to kill. But there you go. All righty. Aren't food shortages a crisis of overproduction? Well, the food shortages that we're facing in the world now are a result of the fact that Russia is a major food exporter and they can't export. Ukraine is a major food exporter and they're in the middle of a war. It's a result of droughts that are taking place. It's a result of supply chain issues related to the pandemic, about the fact that demand has gone up because people are now going out and doing stuff. When the pandemic, things slowed down. It's a result of a number of different things, but I mean, it is true that people are starving because there's too much food under normal times. But right now we're facing issues with food production around the world. So it's a little bit of a different circumstance. All right. Leadership of the CPUSA by Sam Webb and John Bechtel. Well, I remember Sam Webb. I was in Cleveland. Sam Webb came to speak. I met Sam Webb a few times, and I was not in the Communist Party. I was never in the Communist Party. I was in the Workers' World Party. Before that, I was around a Maoist group. I was with them briefly. Sam Webb was very much, it was very much this, what do you call it? Very much this, this tendency of, well, it'll gradually happen. And I went to a lot of workshops that were put on by the Communist Party or the committees of correspondence that were like that, and I remember there was a panel. I remember at the U.S. Social Forum in 2010, there was a panel of speakers from the Communist Party, from Freedom Road Socialist Organization, from committees of correspondence, and from DSA, and they were all putting out more or less that economic determinist, gradual. It's Bernstein revisionism. One step at a time, we'll gradually get there, but we got to defeat the Republicans. What I thought was amusing is it was like I would listen to these lectures by like Sam Webb supporters and stuff, and it was like they didn't seem to like understand that like we have a two-party system in the United States, and as you enter a revolutionary crisis, like things don't just move in a straight line. Like the extreme right wing gets stronger as well, and it was like in their minds we just have to completely demolish the Republicans. Like the Republicans have to just be completely wiped off the map. And then the Democrats will split into the pro-monopoly Democrats and the anti-monopoly Democrats. And the anti-monopoly Democrats will gradually implement socialism. And I'm like, that's not how it works, right? The Republican Party is going to exist. We have a two-party system. So yeah, the Democrats might become more radical, but the Republicans are also going to become more extreme right. And I remember listening at the time and thinking, wait, they had this narrative where we're just going to completely demolish the Republicans because they're fascists. Once the Republicans are just completely vanquished, they like don't exist, then the Democrats will divide into two between like socialistic ones like Bernie Sanders and like boring ones like Joe Biden or something. And I remember hearing that narrative and thinking that's like the stupidest thing. And I remember talking to people that were around the CPUSA at the time, and some people said they thought maybe they worked backwards. They started with the conclusion, which is you have to support the Democrats. And then they worked backwards. Like, how can we somehow make this, if you read the documents that Sam Webb wrote, defeating the right wing on the road to socialism, stuff like that, it's a little bit delusional, right? It's like, we're just going to defeat the Republicans. The Republicans are just going to be completely, vanquished. No more right wingers ever. And then once that's the case, then the Democrats will divide. And it's like, this isn't how politics works. I'm sorry, that's not when there's a political crisis. You don't just get one faction. I mean, it was very, very weird. And Bechtel was part of that clique. So, and John Bechtel wrote a horrendous article. He wrote an article saying that Russia was the greatest danger in Europe. And look, it's very clear that the Communist Party is heavily infiltrated and that there are deep state elements in the Communist Party that are pushing it in certain directions. Now, there's a lot of good people in the Communist Party too, right? But I mean, when they published an article in People's World saying that Russia was the greatest threat, and when they went into this hysterical overdrive against the Center for Political Innovation, we were nothing but friendly to them. We never were hostile to them. We were always kind to them. And they like made up stories claiming we broke into their office, and they published this like screed on their website. They don't do that. The Communist Party generally likes to pretend other groups don't exist. So for the Communist Party to publish this screed, like comparing me to Glenn Greenwald and stuff like that, that's deep state stuff. right? That they don't like the fact that I work for RT. They don't like the fact that I've been to Russia and spoken at conferences in Venezuela and around the world, and they see me as a foreign asset, right? The deep state does, and the people that are in the Communist Party, whose job it is to make sure that that foreign assets are not gaining any influence or whatever, they went into overdrive against me. And whatever, they're doing their job. That's what they do. But that's what's going on there, because it's like, it doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't make any sense, right? Because it's very bizarre. But yeah, the Sam Webb years are over, right? Sam Webb is out. John Bechtel is still in, and it's the Communist Party, right? And we were nothing but friendly to them. We were never trying to infiltrate them. We were never trying to take them over. We were just doing our thing. And a lot of people in the CPUSA liked our thing and liked to hear our message. And then they flipped out and had a panic attack and acted pretty weird. So there you go. All right. Very good. So when the United States built the power grid and railroads, that wasn't really capitalism. That was Bonapartism, right? I mean, and there is a feeling, that the state should fund infrastructure, build these things. Roosevelt's, power programs, the Tennessee Valley Authority and all that. That was Roosevelt being a Bonapartist and trying to use Bonapartist power to stabilize capitalism. Right? And there's always some degree of collective capitalist ownership, right? The post office isn't socialism, right? The post office is in the U.S. Constitution. And the idea is that you should have a government-run post office. Why? Because it needs to treat every capitalist equally. If a private company ran the post office, it would show favoritism to companies that were aligned with it or connected with it, and it would make the mail late for companies that weren't. You have to have a government-run post office to stabilize capitalism. You have to have public roads, right? If one company owned the roads and was making profits from it and was competing with other companies, people wouldn't be able to go where they need to go. You have to have government-run roads. And that even Adam Smith, even the most extreme Milton Friedman, people like that, admitted that you have to have the government facilitate some things. They have to make sure the mail comes on time. They have to have an army. They have to have a fire department. They have to have a police. So, that's part of it. But what Roosevelt did, which building infrastructure, that was Roosevelt, acting like a Bonapartist to try and stabilize capitalism amid a crisis. All right. The unique anti-communism in America that you don't see to the rest of the world. You have to look at it this way. The McCarthyism in the United States, it was the Spanish Inquisition. Right? Monty Python, they used to have a thing. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. But the Spanish Inquisition, right? In Europe in like the 1490s, right? You had Martin Luther, who nailed his thesis to the wall of a church. And in Germany, you had all these Christians were born with the Catholic Church. And they were breaking with feudalism, right? It was the emerging capitalist class breaking with feudalism. And the Catholic Church was the institution that upheld feudalism. So they were revolting against the Catholic Church. It was the beginning of the overthrow of feudalism. And in England, you had Protestants, and you had Protestants in France, John Calvin and others. And all over Europe, you had the Protestant Reformation. But Spain was a stronghold of the Catholic Church. So what did they do in Spain? In Spain, they did what they called the Inquisition, which is that they said, okay, it ain't going to happen here. It might be happening in all the other countries, but it ain't going to happen here. So in Spain, they went after the Jews. They went after the Muslims. They went after anybody. I mean, they just started going after anybody who said anything, scientists, anybody, burning people at the stake, torturing people. That's what they did, because all over the rest of Europe, the Reformation was happening. But there was one area where it hadn't happened yet. And they said, all right, we are going to make sure it doesn't happen. That's what McCarthyism is. All right, McCarthyism was, in Western Europe, big, huge communist parties came out of the Second World War, defeated the Nazis, were a big part of the government. And so Africa and Asia, right? So in the United States, they said, we're going to make sure this doesn't happen here. And so it was the Spanish Inquisition. And yeah, U.S. society has been kind of defined by that kind of Spanish Inquisition, that there was just this effort to crush anything that sounded communist in order to make sure it didn't happen. But in a weird way, and this is what's interesting, in a weird way, it might give us the upper hand now, because the Cold War is over. And, it's not like people have all heard this. You go to Europe, Western Europe, and all that. People have all heard this. All this stuff about overproduction. They've heard this. They've heard this their whole lives. They know about Marxism. They know about labor unions. Not in the United States. They haven't heard it before. Right? It's it's been such an overdrive against it. People never heard this, and it's going to have a new energy as things start moving in a socialist direction here. It's going to have an energy that it won't have in Europe. Right? The left in Europe, after the financial crisis, they fell on their face because they had no energy, because they've been around for a long time. These socialist and communist groups have been around for a long time. The Greek Communist Party has been around forever. The French Communist Party has been around forever. There's Marxist groups. Everybody in France has a relative or a cousin who's a communist. And, but now in the United States, when socialism starts getting going again, which it is, it's going to have an energy it doesn't have, because it's not like it's been around for 100 years and everybody knows about it. They cut it off in the 50s. And when it comes, it's going to be new, and it's going to have a fresh wave of energy. All right. Super chat question. Can you recommend good books authored by the CPUSA before the party became revisionist? All right. Why did the People's Republic of China encourage capitalist agriculture? Well, that's not exactly true, right? At first, they gave everyone their own land. They broke apart, the nobles' land, the landlords' land, and they gave everyone their individual land. And then they put pressure on people to form communes, and then eventually those communes merged into collective farms. And yeah, I mean, the agricultural process in China was not encouraging capitalist agriculture. They did what Stalin did in the Soviet Union, a lot slower and a lot quicker, a lot slower and a lot more stable. All right. Some of the people, including Elliott and his son, argued FDR was friendlier to Stalin than Churchill, and he would have ended colonialism. All right. We'll talk about that. All right. Yeah, I mean, that's not an accurate assessment of the Chinese agricultural system. All right. CPI should do a book on Marx and Lincoln. I actually think we should. I mean, there are books about it, but it'd be good if we published one. Writings of Abraham Lincoln, writings of Marx on the Civil War and such. That would be a good thing for us to do, right? With an introduction and stuff. Because, I have had people, like, there was somebody on the internet who was tweeting at me that I must be an idiot because everyone knows that Lincoln had nothing to do with Marxism. And I just showed them the articles and stuff, and then they just called me an idiot and called me a Nazi and said there's nothing different. There's patriotic socialism and national socialism are the same thing. I'm like, dude, this is a historical fact. Joseph Wedemeyer, August Willich, like the Union Army had a Marxist division in it. Karl Marx was writing for the Republican Party newspaper of New York City. Horace Greeley, who was this radical abolitionist and political leader in New York City, hired Karl Marx to work for him and was distributing Marx's writings to stir up the abolitionists of New York City. Marx and his followers endorsed Abraham Lincoln in the 1864 election, and Lincoln wrote them a letter back and thanked them for it. It's just a fact. And it's like these people, they have it in their head. No, I'm a woke. America's always been evil. No, Lincoln, he's respected in America, so he must be pure evil. And it's like, again, you're not thinking like a Marxist. If you divide the world between good people and bad people, you're not thinking like a Marxist. No one's here is trying to say Lincoln was good. Lincoln did execute Native Americans. Lincoln was considerably racist, but Lincoln was forced by material conditions to play a good role, right? And that the role that Lincoln played in American history was a pretty damn good one. It was a pretty damn good role that he played in American history, and he was forced by material conditions. And Marxists saw that there was a clash between the northern industrial economy and the southern plantation economy. They saw that, and they intervened, right? They did what you're supposed to do. Divisions in society intervene, and they did the right thing, and that's what Marxists do. I didn't really understand Marxism. I just started understanding Marxism in about 2010. Until then, I viewed it almost like religion. I thought if we just get the right words and incantations, but when I read The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster, and I read about Marx's support for Lincoln, and I read about Marx's debate with the anarchists, and I read about the debates, the fights in the Second International and Edward Bernstein and revisionism, then I started really understanding Marxism. And I didn't even know half the stuff I know now. But Marxism is not simple stuff, right? And that Marxism is a science of understanding the objective laws of history and intervening to try and push forward the contradictions. So there you go. All right. Could the USA integrate into the Belt and Road without changing its system? In theory, yes, right? I mean, that doesn't require people to change their system. It would begin our economic benefit to do so. The only reason there might be a system change in order to do it is because there would be so much of a pushback by the capitalists who hate China and view China as a competitor that their power would have to be pushed back. And that would require the working people to mobilize, and that might lead to a change in the system. But ultimately, yes, China would accept the USA to sign the Belt and Road today, immediately, without any change in our system. And we would be welcome to sign the Belt and Road immediately. You know, if we wanted to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, China would happily allow it without us changing their system. There may be powerful capitalists who are preventing that, I think, and would like to prevent that from happening. And the only way that a system change would be related to that would be that the power of the forces that would be resisting that would have to be pushed back, and that might change things a lot. But in theory, no. In theory, no. All right. Good books authored by the CPUSA before they became revisionist. Why Communism? Plain Talk on Vital Questions by Moishe Olgin. Towards Soviet America by William Z. Foster. Twilight of World Capitalism by William Z. Foster. What else? There's some good ones. Brother Bill McKay by Philip Bonosky. That's a great book about how Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company was unionized. A very good book about the history of the auto workers unions, published in the 50s. A really good piece of writing. What else? There's a lot of good books from that time. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. She wrote an autobiography, I Speak My Peace. That's very, very good. There's a lot of things, a lot of good pieces of writing from this period. You know, Victor Perlow, the economist. He wrote, I believe I've got one of his books. I've got it somewhere. It's called American Imperialism. It's by Victor Perlow. Yeah, it's right back here. It's very good. It's from the 1950s, just as the Cold War was starting. Victor Perlow wrote this book, American Imperialism. That's very, very good. Very, very good writing. Ideas They Cannot Jail by Eugene Dennis. That's a very, very good book. It's about McCarthyism. It's about the Cold War. It's like all the speeches they put out during the time they were on trial for the Smith Act and trying to overthrow the government. That's a very, very good book. Ideas They Cannot Jail by Eugene Dennis. The New Europe by William Z. Foster is a good book. I'm just asking me to name off books. They published a lot of good books during that time period. I'll tell you that much. A lot of good books during that time period. No doubt about it. All righty. Next question. FDR was friendlier to Stalin than Churchill and would have ended colonialism, according to Elliot Roosevelt. Yes, FDR was a Bonapartist. And his Bonapartism, if he had lived, would have, he was pro-Soviet in a lot of ways. And he was so tied in with the labor movement. In order to stay in power, he would have been pro-Soviet and such. And that's why people are suspicious that Roosevelt may have been assassinated, because I always get suspicious when someone's death is perfectly timed. When it comes right at a certain moment, that's when I get suspicious. When people die at exactly the time. And Roosevelt, he died right as they were getting ready for the Cold War. During World War II, the Soviet Union was our ally. During World War II, he was talking about an economic Bill of Rights. During World War II, they were promoting the idea that racism was the enemy because it was helping the Nazis and it was un-American. And just as the USA transitioned away from the progressivism of World War II, and you had to have Truman to drop those atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Roosevelt wouldn't have done that. You had to have Truman, whip up and escalate the Cold War and get us into the Korean War. Roosevelt wouldn't have done that. Yeah, Roosevelt was a Bonapartist. His strength came from the labor unions. And yeah, his death was way too conveniently timed. I'll tell you that much. All right, folks. It looks like there aren't any more super chat questions. So I guess I will start wrapping up. I guess I'll bring on our closing music, or I'll recite it because I want us to recite it, right? A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. A government of action to fight for working families. Out of the movement to the masses. Out of the movement to the masses. Dare to struggle, dare to win, and have a good night, everyone.